Alright guys, still getting set up. Just figured I would just press the play button, God knows why. So, I don't know what's happening here, but here we go. Alright guys, today we're going to talk about the endocrine system. Let me adjust this. Alright, endocrine system. It's part of your chapter 21. For some reason they put hematology in with the endocrine system, but we're doing the endocrine portion today. Yeah, skip that. Anyway, so one of the things that they're really going to stress and what they're pushing really hard is, and it's something that we deal with in EMS a lot of the time, has to do with diabetic emergencies. We're going to dive into that. We're going to talk about some different medical conditions and how they're all related to the diabetes and the different types of diabetes and what diabetes does. For some reason, all the other endocrine hormones and glands are not really discussed. I don't know why, but I'm assuming that we may or may not get to come back to it. I know when we do the advanced portion, I will probably hit it a lot harder and heavy, just so you're aware of it for testing purposes. But for, even this being an advanced book that we're using, they only really stress the diabetic emergency. So that was the main focus, but I threw a couple other things in there just because I wanted you to be aware, like I usually do. You're welcome. They talk about the endocrine system and how it influences everything. It's part of the homeostasis, cells, organs, bodily function. It's part of all of it. So that's kind of a redundant slide. In this slide, they point out to what all the glands are. They talk about the pituitary. We will touch on that. It's the master gland. They talk about the thyroid, parathyroid, and they talk about the pancreas. That's pretty much what they mainly discuss. But I want you to keep in mind the adrenal glands that are on top of the kidneys. That's part of it. The ovaries or the testicles. That's part of it. There's a lot more to the endocrine system than what you're actually getting. I really honestly feel you're not getting your money's worth, but we will touch on them, and I will give you your money's worth. All right, so the pituitary gland. It is called the master gland. It is basically kind of connected to the brainstem. If you'll notice, it's right here. There's your brainstem. There's your upper cerebral function, your cerebellum. So basically, it's kind of higher function, but not. It's higher in function up in the brainstem. And it basically monitors all the glands and in your body. Basically, it's kind of the monitor of the endocrine system. Now, the funny thing about the pituitary gland, it does not secrete hormones that affect the body directly. It is more like a king sitting on a crown, or sitting with his crown on a throne, and he is basically getting feedback from his kingdom, and then he says, that's not working. Let me send a messenger. Let me send a messenger out to that area that's not working, and let me send the message of what they need to do. They need to secrete more hormone. And that's basically how it works. That's it in a nutshell. The pituitary gland, it is divided up into a anterior and a posterior. The anterior is credited with making all of these hormones. Posterior with those. I just wanted to let you know this slide is just for front and back. This slide is to show you all the hormones that are made, and if they're made in the anterior or the posterior, and what they do. We're really going to just touch on only, like I said, the pancreas and the diabetic stuff. So really, truly, we really don't talk about anything else. There's so much to the endocrine system. It is a very big system, and yet we're only going to touch a little bit on thyroid, like a few slides, and then some diabetes stuff. So how this works. First, let me start by describing something called a positive feedback. That's not what you're seeing on the slide, obviously, but we're going to discuss positive feedback. Positive feedback simply works with, we have a problem. Now, we've got a solution. Is it working? Yes. Keep doing it. That's exactly how positive feedback works. Is it working? Yes, keep doing it. Is it working? Yes, keep doing it. Is it working? No, fix it. Is this working? Yes. Now, is it working? Yes. That's how positive feedback works. Negative feedback works a lot differently. Negative feedback works like, is this working? No, keep doing it. Keep sending out more hormone, stimulating hormone. Is there enough? No, there isn't. Keep sending out more. Is what we're doing enough? No, we need to keep sending out more hormone. And the reason why I bring up the negative feedback loop is the fact that it is exactly how your pituitary gland works. It basically says, hey, is this working? Do we have enough hormone? Are we monitoring correctly? Are we getting what we need to maintain homeostasis? It all comes back to the pituitary gland. And if the pituitary gland and your basically figures out that, no, it's not working, all right, let's send out more stimulating hormone. Basically send out another message to the area of the body that needs to be stimulated. I'm going to go send out the stimulating hormone to stimulate the target organ. And that's how it works. It's like a thermostat. You basically set it to a set point where you want it to be. You're expecting X level of expectation of how the body should run. So you set it has a set point. And believe it or not, the body is used to having certain set points. For instance, people that have hypertension, they live with hypertension, and their body actually becomes adjusted to hypertension. In fact, so much that if they live with it long enough and start taking anti-hypertension medications, they basically start taking their medicine to lower their blood pressure, they feel weak, they feel tired, because they're used to having their blood pressure at a certain point. When it's dropped down, they're not used to that. Lowering your blood pressure makes you tired and sleepy and groggy. So putting their blood pressure within normal limits, even though it's good for the body and it's healthy, they're not used to it, so they have to adjust. With that being said, your body has a certain set point, especially when it comes to the endocrine system. It says, hey, do we have enough? It's like setting the thermostat. You set it to a temperature, and then it runs and works up until the point where the temperature is reached. When you've reached that temperature, you shut it off. And that's exactly how the endocrine system works on a negative feedback loop. Is basically your body monitors, is it doing enough? No, it is not doing enough. All right, let's stimulate it some more. And that's how the negative feedback works. Is this working? No, keep doing this. Is it working? No, keep doing this. So let's talk about your thyroid gland. The stimulating hormone makes the thyroid secrete thyroxine. And it basically has to do with a lot of metabolic functions. It has to do with your digestion, your heart rate, and basically how well your body actually functions in a wakeful state. On the back of the thyroid gland, if you were to take the thyroid gland here and basically take it, flip it, and turn it around, you'll have the parathyroid glands. Now, the parathyroid glands, believe it or not, have nothing to do with thyroid usage or doing metabolic function. The parathyroid is stimulated to monitor calcitonin. It'll secrete calcitonin, and it has to do with regulating how much calcium and the calcium levels in your body and where to break it down. If there's too much, to excrete it through the kidneys to build it back up if you don't have enough, or if there's too much in the bone marrow to break it down. It basically is regulate calcium, and calcium is a very important electrolyte in bodily functions, not just in building bones. So calcium has to do with a lot of your muscle movements. You need calcium to move muscle. So calcium and having a lot of free calcium in the bloodstream is very, very important. So that's the parathyroid. Remember the good old pancreas. We talked about it in the digestive emergencies chapter, how it had a exocrine and an endocrine function. The exocrine, it makes digestive juices. It comes in, the head of the pancreas comes in the common bile duct, and it winds up dumping into the duodenum or the duodenum, however you want to say it. But believe it or not, outside of that, it has an endocrine function. The endocrine function has to do with making glucagon and also insulin. So we're going to talk about that here a little bit. It all starts in what's called the islets of Langerhans, and it actually was discovered by someone by the name of Langerhans, and this is what he decided to call them. He discovered it. He gets to name it. That's just how it works. So inside the islets of Langerhans, there are several types of cells, but the cells that you're really worried about are the alpha cells and the beta cells. The alpha cells release glucagon, which, remember, go back to the liver and release the glycogen stores and releases it into glucose. Releases glycogen stores into glucose. Therefore, increasing your blood sugar level. The beta cell releases insulin, and we'll talk a little bit about what insulin does and what it's good for and the blood sugar and how actually glucose gets into the cell, but it will technically decrease blood sugar levels. All right, remember, two things that our body or our cells love the most. Remember, it is glucose and oxygen. For all intents and purpose, when we talk about aerobic metabolism, which we will get into here in a little bit, aerobic metabolism, sugar and oxygen. That's what our body loves, especially our brain. Our brain loves sugar and oxygen, and of course, all of our cells need sugar and oxygen. So it's a major source of energy. There needs to be a way to get the glucose into the body. Well, it's done several ways. You can actually eat sugar. And when you eat the sugar, if it's simple sugar, it'll break down and it'll get absorbed as just simple sugar. You can eat carbohydrates. They're long chain carbohydrates, long chain sugars, and then your body has a process to break those down into simple sugars. And so you also have the glycogen stores in the liver that insulin is obviously secreted, and it'll come out and release the glycogen stores into glucose. So therefore, you have a backup in the event that you actually wind up fasting. If you wind up not being able to eat, you have a backup. So that being said, how you get the glucose into the cell is by insulin. You need insulin. Insulin is literally labeled the key to the cell to getting glucose in. How does it work? Somehow, some way, and this is deeper than me, but all I know to do is explain it to you. Insulin comes in to a receptor site on the cell, and it literally is like an unlocking mechanism, but it doesn't unlock it at the point that it touches. It unlocks it somewhere over here. It's kind of like a hidden door. You basically need to unlock the lock for the insulin to allow the glucose molecules to come in. And that's how that works. Without the insulin, you're not going to be able to get the blood glucose or the glucose that's in the bloodstream into the cell. So it's very important that you understand that you have glucose in the bloodstream, but it will do no good. Just because it's there, it will do no good unless you have the insulin also to accompany it to get it into the cell. So it's a bifold thing. You need both of those things to make this work, to get energy to work. All right, so we talk about hypo and hyperglycemia. We're gonna dive into that. Basically, hyperglycemia means high blood sugar. Means that you got a lot of blood sugar or a lot of glucose in the bloodstream, but it's not getting into the cells. Hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, means that there is not enough glucose in the blood. More than likely, there is plenty of insulin, but you do not have enough glucose in the bloodstream to be able to accommodate the cells and what they need. So those are the two end of the spectrum. Glucagon's role, we've already talked about it, is basically to prevent blood sugar from dropping too low. Like I said, you can eat, but there's sometimes you just go and you're just having a good time, or you might be poor and you may not have enough food. Something happens where you go on a fast, or even really, really truthfully, you might get sick. And if you get sick, you don't want to eat, you don't feel good, and so how your body combats that is it stores in the liver the glycogen. The glycogen is stored in the liver, and glucagon is the key to unlock that. Unlock it and turn it into glucose so you can use it for cellular energy. So that's what you really are having the glucagon stores for. It is basically your body's way of saying, if we go into a fast, if we need it for later, good, we have it. Because imagine if you didn't have that. Imagine if you did have to eat every 4 to 6 hours. And monitor your blood glucose levels that way because you had no glycogen stores. This is just basically a diagram showing that. It's glycogenesis. When you're creating the glycogen stores, when it's being taken out and turned into glucose due to the glucagon, it's called glycogenolysis. That's actually taking the glycogen stores and turning them into glucose thanks to glucagon. So any endocrine disorders typically have to do and deal with too much secreting of a hormone or not enough. That's usually how we're going to deal with our endocrine issues. We're either secreting too much of a hormone or not enough. They talk about hyperthyroidism where It's an increased metabolism. It's probably why Hilly has to eat every 30 minutes, because he probably does have an increased metabolism. He probably burns through glucose and carbohydrates very quickly, and that's probably why he's always at the microwave every 30 minutes. So one of the pancreatic diseases that we're going to talk about that has to do with the insufficiency of insulin is diabetes mellitus. And there are two types of diabetes mellitus. So basically what's happening is, in diabetes mellitus, also called DM, or just straight diabetes, or the BTs, or diabetes, it winds up being that insulin is not being made by the pancreas. Now, there's two types. There are two types of that. But one of the ways that you can, when we get to those types, one of the ways that you can recognize that someone is probably hyperglycemic, meaning they have a lot of blood glucose but no insulin to unlock the cell, to let the sugar into the cells, is they basically have what's called the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps of diabetes. And one is polyphagia, they're always hungry. Polydipsia, always thirsty. And polyuria means they have to constantly and frequently urinate. Now, let me tell you why it exists. You eat, obviously, to take in what your body cannot make. So you eat it and digest it. You make proteins, glucose, and stuff like that. So as you absorb that through your digestive tract, your cells are recognizing, and that even your brain cells are recognizing that you are not getting sugar in there. So your body says, we don't have enough sugar in here to get into these cells. And it's not recognizing that it doesn't have any insulin. It just sees or senses that no sugar is getting into the cells. We must be hungry because we must not have enough storage, glycogen storage, and we must not have enough glucose in our bloodstream to get it into the cells. So you're hungry. That's why you eat when you have diabetes and it's uncontrolled. And you're eating because you're not getting in the glucose storage. But that's not the truth. You will have plenty of glucose, just no insulin. But your body doesn't recognize that. You're always thirsty. Polydipsia. With the blood glucose, or the glucose in the blood, elevating and getting higher and higher, your body can't handle that. Your body does sense like, whoa, there's too much sugar in the blood, but it's not recognizing that it's not getting into the cells. It just recognizes that, hey, there's too much in the bloodstream. We need to monitor this, and we need to make something happen with this. Let's just go ahead and pee off the excess, the sugar. And you can move sugar that way. You can move several things that way. You can move salt that way too. You can move electrolytes that way. And so what your body is doing is you're going to go ahead and urinate it off. That's why you're having constant urination with hyperglycemia. With that being said, is you're peeing off a lot of water. You're becoming hypotensive. You're becoming dehydrated. Therefore, your body's like, hey, I need more fluid intake. Now, granted, if we were caveman days, this would probably, be an issue and no one would live from it. But we think we're thirsty. What we should be drinking, obviously, is water to help replace the fluid that we're lost. But not in America. In America, we wind up drinking sodas, juices, something that has more sugar in it, and we wind up doing more damage than good. So that's the 3 Ps. That's how they work, and that's why they are the 3 Ps of hyperglycemia. So when you have hyperglycemia, you start having what's called like acidosis. And we are going to talk about that. And I kind of figured out why the blood was in, the hematology was in with the endocrine, because all they talked about was diabetes, really, and the acidosis, which is a acidotic condition of the blood itself. But also, with that being said, excess sugar makes you acidotic in your bloodstream. You actually start having damage done to your nerves, your nerve damage. You start having nerve damage to usually the lower part of the extremities, usually the feet. Start having neuropathy. When they talk about like diabetic nerve pain, it's basically where they have the shock or tingling sensation in their feet, and it hurts, it's painful, because it's actually you're having damage done to the nerve endings, and they typically start in the feet. Kidney damage, because you're trying to filter through so much sugar. Also, it causes hypertension. with the hypertension that's damaging to the kidneys as well, but also the nerves that go to the kidneys as well. You're damaging those. So kidney failure is a bad juju for diabetics. Causing the hypertension, you'll start having diabetic retinopathy, which basically means that you start going blind. Or clouding of the lens or the cataract. That's just due to the fact that the blood vessels so constricted that you're just not getting enough blood flow to the eye to keep them working properly. We did talk about some of the nerve pain, the kidney function. With the constricting of the blood vessels and the acidosis, you actually have to start worrying about cerebrovascular disease or stroke, basically, and hypertension. Hypertension is real bad. You don't want to have that. So if you are diagnosed with diabetes, it becomes a real true issue, and a lot of people try to blow it off. But you need to have these people watch their blood glucose level. They need to check it. They need to do finger sticks every day, or now they got the thing where they stick in your arm. You can use your cell phone and just put it up to the monitor that's kind of implanted in your arm, and it monitors it right then and there. So it's pretty neat. It's a neat feature. So there's two types of diabetes. There's two types. And remember, diabetes is hyperglycemic with no insulin made. It's not, or not enough insulin made. Type 1 is usually a juvenile onset. It's usually discovered in children, and it usually has to do with the pancreas itself makes zero insulin or very minimal amounts. So they wind up having to take insulin shots. They've done it since they were children. They actually probably graduate into an insulin pump, and it pumps insulin and monitors. I've seen over the past 10, 15 years get fancier and fancier. But they pretty much have to watch what they eat, how much of they eat, constantly watch their blood glucose level, and try to monitor and manage that. And they've been doing it since they were children. Usually there's some sort of episode where they're altered or and they can't figure out what's going on, and their blood glucose levels through the roof. But that's typically how it happens. It's usually about when they're between ages 8 and 12, and they have an onset like that, and it's just altered mental status, and it goes from there. So these are the people that are typically used to dealing with it. Again, they require insulin. They do have pumps to try to control the blood glucose, and they have new fandangled ways of checking that. Type 2 diabetes usually is due to typically body habitus, your weight and age. Insulin is still being produced, but it's just not enough to meet up with the demands. And unfortunately, in the society we live, we love sugars, we love our carbohydrates, we love our sodas, and we don't eat as healthy as we should as a nation. So there are going to be more type 2 diabetics prevalent, and it is typically in the geriatric population. Like I said, obesity will play a role in it, so you have to watch out for that. So if you have kind of a heavier set younger person, they're diabetic, don't be surprised. And if they say they're not type 1, they say they're type 2. And they say, yeah, I was like 30 when this happened. I figured out I was diabetic when I was 30. And they may not have the altered mental status. They may just went to the doctor, say, I'm not feeling good, I'm kind of run down. I've been peeing a lot, and I'm just real thirsty and hungry all the time. And they'll find out through blood work that they do have diabetes type 2. How we check blood sugar. We use our glucometers. If we were in class, that'd be something we would do to each other. We would do finger sticks, but we're not in class. One of the medications that they take is metformin. There's other ones like Januvia. I think there's a new one out. I can't remember the name, but it says it uses some of its body's insulin or help activate more insulin somehow. But they're basically long-acting, short-acting medications that help out with basically like insulin that they use. So they may not take straight insulin. They can get to a point where they are if they get to a certain blood glucose level and they can't control it anymore. But if they can control it with oral medication, they will. There is something called pre-diabetes. It's kind of new to me. Basically, they have the risk factors for type 2 diabetes. Their A1C, which is a blood marker for glucose in the body, it'll be close to being over where it needs to be on the normal range. But it's just pre-diabetic stuff, and it gives you risk factors. Again, it's the same thing that I've said before. They're older, Overweight will do it. Hypertension will do it. Family history of diabetes, that'll do it too, especially if they're type 2. Typically, type 1 diabetes is a genetic condition, but it's typically, like I said, caught early in the onset. But being overweight also can be a family risk factor. You can have overweight parents, and then you wind up being overweight, and that's just the roll of the dice. And it's all on how you manage your physical activity, what you eat, and your intake, and things of that nature. Gestational diabetes. What that means is you can have a woman who becomes pregnant wind up having diabetes. I don't understand all of it really, but basically there's not a lot of insulin being produced, or it's produced to help with the infant, something of that nature, and so it's robbed from the mother. But basically winds up being that the mom becomes diabetic. If you do get prenatal care, you'll see that they'll have you do this fasting glucose test, and you have to come in and you have to drink the glucose. Like they give you an early morning appointment. You can't eat after a certain period of time. Then you have to drink this nasty sugar drink. And then you go in after several hours and they check your glucose levels to make sure that you're not falling into the diabetic range. So, it can be managed, and believe it or not, it's really funny. It goes away once they have the baby. So that's gestational diabetes. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum, hypoglycemia. It winds up being that you can have diabetics that don't make enough insulin, make themselves hypoglycemic. They will give themselves too much insulin, or they won't eat enough food. The big things that I usually find are the diabetics that went to bed, checked their sugar, they noticed that it was above a certain amount. They had to give themselves a certain amount of insulin, because they call it a sliding scale. So if you fall somewhere in between this range, give yourself this many units. This range, a little bit less units, and or above this range, give yourself this many units. So what they'll do is they'll dose themselves as if they were still going to be awake. When you go to rest, it's a little different. You need to be very careful for the diabetic patients that go and are resting. They'll give themselves the insulin, or take an excess amount of metformin, and then they wake up in the middle of the night, or they're not waking up in the middle of the night. Thank God they were sleeping with their spouse or loved one, and they notice that something's wrong. They're not acting right, or they're hot, or they're cold and they're sweaty. And now, oh my goodness, here we go. So, and basically how that works is when your blood sugar drops, the first line of defense is to reduce the insulin production. The second line of defense is to release catecholamines out of the adrenaline gland. Now, we didn't really talk about the adrenal gland today, but it sits on top of the kidneys. It releases adrenaline. And what that is like a rush. It increases your heart rate, jacks your blood pressure. It gives you insane amount of strength. So you need to be very careful with these patients. I'll tell you a little bit more about that here in a minute. We already talked about most of this. Type 1s, the Ehlers-Danlos do not make insulin. Type 2, they do. And with a catecholamine release, you need to be careful. So with that being said, you do have some of these older patients that are type 2 diabetics. They might even been type 1. I'll give you a quick, for instance, got called out to the Huddle House one night for a very violent man. And thank goodness this man had been eating at this restaurant for a very long time, religiously. The waitstaff knew who he was and knew he was a diabetic, because he was standing at the back of the restaurant hurling anything he can get his hands on at everyone. He had what we call just this crazy special, quote-unquote, special strength. And that has to do with the catecholamine release. So you will find that when you have to go and wrestle with these diabetics, even the older population, do not underestimate them. When you're going to have to start a line on them, or try to give them a shot of glucagon, or give them D50, it's going to be a fight. It's going to be horrible, because they are having such an adrenaline rush that it's going to take 4 or 5 of you just to hold them down, to be able to get one of you to work on them. So, just letting you know that exists. It's out there. Been there, done that more than once. And I did get my butt whooped. I got bruises and claw marks and scratches to prove it. All right, so we're going to go back and talk about some conditions of hyperglycemia, elevated blood glucose level. One is ketoacidosis. This is typically found in type 1 diabetics. And it is a very, very bad state for a diabetic to be in. It can be gradual. It can be rapid. It all depends on the insulin and how much sugar and how much they're monitoring. Typically, where you'll find people in DKA is the older people that are diabetics. They know they're diabetics, and they don't watch their blood glucose levels. And again, it's typically going to be in the type 1 diabetic patients because they're not and they stop monitoring their blood glucose level. So what happens is that basically they have the 3 Ps and they're not recognizing the signs and symptoms. And where your book typically says the DKA point is when you're checking a blood glucose finger stick, they say 350, 400. I've heard that it could be upwards of 600, 650. The literature has changed over the years that I've been doing this, but just know that it's that normal. Let's just go back to normal. Normal is like 120 or to 80 to 120. And how I remember that is that I think normal blood pressure is 120 over 80. So 80 to 120 is the normal range. Anything below 70-ish, they start saying is hypoglycemic. Hyperglycemic is supposed to be over 120. And then 400 for this lecture, 350 per your book is going to be the part where they start becoming DKA. And again, it's in your type 1s. And what's happening is that you go to a state called ketoacidosis. You can go into become unresponsive, go into a coma, and when they say coma, that's diabetic coma. That's what they mean. And eventually, if it's left untreated or they're not found, like you do have some people that live alone that don't really interact with anybody, it can become very serious, and it can lead to death. And what a ketone is, it's something that your liver makes. It's whenever you produce or you don't produce enough insulin to get your body to let the glucose into the cell, you start using and burning fat. Well, fats are not as effective as sugar. Fats are nowhere near effective making the amount of ATP that's being needed to use in the cell. So the byproduct of that is the ketone, and it winds up making the ketones spill out into the bloodstream. There's nowhere for them to go. You try to pee them off, but then it'll build up, and it makes you more acidic. If you remember, aerobic and anaerobic, when we talked about it before, we talked about having oxygen in the cell, making sure the cell had enough oxygen. Well, there's a flip side to this. If you don't have enough glucose, you can still go into anaerobic metabolism. You may have enough oxygen. That's all well and good. You're breathing. No problem. But you don't have enough sugar, corona, to go into the cell and actually make ATP that way. So there's another side of this that you can have for anaerobic metabolism. With that being said, you start having acidosis because the ketones release an extra hydrogen ion, making you acidic. So that's how you start becoming acidotic. Let's talk about pH right quick. One of the things that we have not talked about is the blood buffering system. This is where it ties into the hematology. It really didn't talk about it in the chapter, but this is how I am going to tie it in. Basically, if you're not familiar with chemistry, you never took chemistry class, there's a scale of 0 to 14 for pH. And usually the P is not big, the P is little. And it's something like per hydrogen or something like that, or part hydrogens or something like that. So 0 to 7 or less is what's known as acidotic. 7 is absolutely neutral. That is neutral. That means a glass of water. A glass of water has a pH of 7. It's not an acid. It's also not a base or an alkaline. And from 7 to 14 is alkalosis, or it has to do with basically it's the reverse spectrum of acids. So the human body's pH is 7.35 to 7.45. Here it says 3.6, but it's 7.35 to 7.45. So we live on the alkalotic side of things. So we can handle and buffer a little bit of acid. So when we get a little bit of acid, we can handle it. But if it becomes too much, that's when we need to figure out how to get rid of it. Burn this into your brain. I'm not saying you have to memorize this. I'm not saying I'm going to test you on this because it is not in your book, at least not in this chapter. If we see it again, we will go over it again and touch on it again. But believe it or not, your body makes something called bicarbonate. One of the things that if you work a cardiac arrest and you get about 10 minutes into the cardiac arrest, we have something called sodium bicarbonate. And what we do is we actually give the patient, put into their body more bicarbonate because they will become acidotic in a cardiac arrest. The reason why we do this is because you have the free hydrogen ions that are making you acidic. So what happens is that this is alkalotic, this is acidic. It winds up, the bicarbonate grabs that free hydrogen and turns into this carbonic acid. Then from there, your body will break down the carbonic acid into CO2 and water. If you'll notice that it's all these parts still add up. You still have 1 carbon, you still have 2 hydrogen, and you still have 3 oxygen, but your body's able to take it and split it and make it into different compounds. So you go from having this here to this here, all because you introduce bicarbonate, which grabs it, makes it carbonic acid, and then your body is able to metabolize it down even further into CO2 and H2O, excuse me. It's wonderful. That's the blood buffering system. Now, what can your body do? Well, your body can definitely take the CO2 in the bloodstream, take it to the alveoli, and you can off-gas it. You can get rid of the CO2 with the water. If there winds up being too much fluid, your body can always use water, but it can also go ahead and take it to the kidneys and urinate it off. So the blood does it instantly. The respiratory system breathes out the CO2. That usually takes seconds. This takes seconds, this takes minutes, and this takes hours, basically, to take the water and flush it out, hours to days. So if you wind up having an acidic event, your body can manage for so long, but you will run out of bicarbonate. Your body has to make this. So if you're using it up faster than you can make it, the scale will tip and you will become acidotic. Just wanted to introduce that to you here because it seemed like a very appropriate time to do it. They talk about kind of the difference with hypoglycemia, DKA, and we're going to talk about HHS next. Now, hyperosmolar hyperglycemic syndrome. I used to know it as HHNS. I think it was hyperosmotic hyperglycemic non-keto acidotic. I don't know, but it winds up being the same thing. This is more found or more common in type 2. This is actually probably a little bit worse than DKA, as in that it takes a while for it to build up. What happens is that diabetics can make insulin. They can still make their own insulin, but with that being said, you're only getting a minimal amount of insulin in. So if a diabetic stops taking their medication, type 2 diabetic stops taking their metformin, they still make a little bit of insulin, and they can still go ahead and use the glucose that's in the bloodstream. So basically, they'll eat, the blood sugar will spike, and then they have a little bit of insulin, so they'll take some of that glucose out, but not enough. It's not like it restores it to normal. And then you have this up, and then slightly down. Up even higher, then slightly back down again. Up higher, so it takes a while for this to happen. And then you'll have this patient that has like a blood glucose reading of like 1200, which is insane, but they don't realize that it's happened. They're like, man, I checked my blood glucose, a couple weeks ago, I was fine, and I haven't bought any more strips, or there'll be some sort of excuse, the reason why they haven't done it, but there they are, and they're extremely hyperglycemic, they're type 2 diabetic, and they're able to use some of the glucose to get it into the cell, but they don't use enough. So they still probably will have the 3 Ps, and then it just slowly builds up over time. And then that's when they start having the seizures or altered mental status, drowsiness, lethargy, and it'll just progress over. Severe dehydration, the dark urine, because they just don't have the fluids to make the urine any brighter, basically. That's kind of how you tell hydration status. So DKA is type 1. It's 400. I didn't really pick a number out for the HHS. But just know that that's how they work. DKA is pretty much no insulin, and your body starts having to break down fats, making ketones. They do the DKA. You will have the fruity odor on the breath, like juicy fruit gum. every once in a while. Just because they're in DKA doesn't mean they'll go altered either, or they're HHS doesn't mean they'll go altered either, but it can happen eventually, and eventually it will if it goes untreated. But remember, HHS is more the type 2. They do make some insulin without taking the medication, but it's not enough. And it just kind of like a rebound effect. It goes up and then it comes down a little bit, then it spikes up high again, then comes down a little bit, spikes high. So you're just constantly building on the level that's already there, but you're able to use some. So that's the two differences. This is just kind of show you that one is acidotic. One has to do with the osmolarity serum. Basically, what that means is that the fluid or in the blood plasma, there's a lot of serum glucose. There's a high concentration of glucose in there. So it won't really be acidotic because they are type 2 and they are using insulin and they're kind of getting rid of some of it, but you'll still have but in here in the DKA, you'll have the acidosis with it. All right, so basically we're going to go to our patient assessment. We'll fly through this like we usually do. BSI, PPE, question your bystanders. Get your level of consciousness. They may be altered mental status, or they might be an altered level of consciousness. Remember, mental status is they might be alert, but they're not home. Like, they're alert and they're just not answering questions appropriately. Level of consciousness has to do with either responsive to voice, responsive to pain, unresponsive. Again, remember when I talked about the acidosis? You may have hyperglycemics with just deep, fast, rapid respirations. That's because they are still having the bicarbonate in their body. They still have enough bicarb in there to go ahead and turn that into the CO2 and the H2O. So they may be trying to breathe faster to literally breathe off the excess CO2. Hypoglycemic patients may have slow breathing. They might be pale, cool, diaphoretic. They'll have the rapid heart rate. Remember, when their blood sugar drops, they release catecholamines, which is basically off the adrenal glands. They're basically dumping a bunch of adrenaline into their body. History, you do your physical exam always. Get your sample, hopefully in your sample from someone, either the patient themselves or someone on scene. You'll find out that they have a medical history somehow, some way of diabetes, because that's pretty much what we focused on today. Secondary assessment, go over the full body. I'm not saying you have to, but you do complete physical exam, but use your best judgment. Obviously, get a blood glucose. Blood glucose, let me just tell you, is considered a baseline vital. So if you say you got baseline vitals and you didn't get a BGL, which is blood glucose level, you did not get baseline vitals. For here in the PowerPoint, it says 7 to 120. I was always taught 80 to 120, but just keep in mind that it could be 70 if you're test taking. Reassess. Always make sure, that especially if you've got a lethargic, hyperglycemic patient, that there's the potential for vomiting. Also, though, in the hypoglycemic patient, same thing. We'll talk about administration of glucose. Position of comfort. Always, you're going to start an IV or a line on these patients. They're hyperglycemic. You're looking to do probably some fluids. Start to give them fluids. Don't slam them with fluids, but just start giving them fluids. If you have a hypoglycemic and they are alert, we can start talking about the oral glucose, which is basically just a thick gel of sugar. They do try to flavor it. Let me just tell you, we've had some expired ones laying around and we decided to try them. They're nasty. The thing about this too, when you go out and you do help with diabetic patients, whether you give them oral glucose or you give them D50, especially if you give them D50, I have to look back and see if it's your advanced, but even if you're on a truck, and it's not an advanced skill to get D50, which I think it is, it's been a while, but you don't leave them unattended without feeding them. I know it sounds stupid. It'll be 3 o'clock in the morning, and the last damn thing you want to do is make them a glass of orange juice and a peanut butter sandwich. But let me tell you, that D50, if they have a lot of insulin, they gave themselves a lot of insulin, and now you give them that sugar, the insulin's going to take that, unlock the cell, and just slam all that sugar into the cell, leaving none left in the bloodstream, and it'll burn through that sugar very quickly to make energy. Especially if they've been hypoglycemic for long, because their metabolic functions just got revved up by the adrenaline. So keep that in mind. So if if you go ahead and give them the D50, please, please, please feed them, give them orange juice, make them drink something, eat something, preferably peanut butter sandwich. It's got carbs, it's got protein from the peanut butter, fats from the peanut butter, carbs from the bread. Orange juice is high in fructose, so it'll give them a good reserve. Also, hopefully you won't be leaving them alone, because the thing about it is when you go to give D50, they're altered. You're like, oh my God, they're altered. You give them D50, give them about 3 to 5 minutes, and they'll wake up like, oh man, what happened? Oh God, you guys are here. Oh, my blood sugar fell again, didn't it? And you're like, yep, it sure did. But also remember we talked about digestion. And digestion, if they digest something, it takes 30 minutes for you to see any effects of any types of medications when they eat something, because it's got to go be digested and go through the hepatic, or also known as the portal circulation. It's got to go through the liver. So if you do oral glucose, it's going to take a while. So unless they're just, they're not too bad, they're just falling, they feel a little weak, they need to eat some sugar, that's okay. You can give them the oral glucose with a low blood sugar reading. But as soon as they go altered, you can't give them. If they cannot swallow or they're altered level of consciousnness, do not try to shove this in their mouth and get them to aspirate on this or choke on it. So that'll be your fault. Again, we talk about the D50. There is weight-based dosing and age-specific too. You give D25 to younger kids, 1 year and older, and then you can do D10. We can show you how to make that when we get there. You can get the hormone glucagon. So what we use, or what I use glucagon for, is I have an altered patient, and then you wind up giving the glucagon. You give it as a shot in the muscle because you're just having a hard time because they're combative. You can't get them to hold still to get a line on them, or there's only a couple of you and there's not enough people to physically hold the patient down. You can't get IV access for whatever reason to give the D50. So you go ahead and you give the glucagon. Remember, the glucagon is a hormone that's going to take the glycogen stores out of the liver. The bad part about that is once you do that, you cannot do that again for another several days. They have to build the glycogen stores back up from eating and having their natural metabolism back up and going to store the glycogen again. So once you give glucagon, you can't do it for another couple of days. So the patient needs to be very, very careful on all of their monitoring of their blood glucose levels. They say 0.5 for children. It's 1 milligram for adults. They're saying DKA here is 250 pre-hospital. You can begin rehydration, but please, please, please do not slam them with fluids. Do not just get a big IV on them and then open the fluids up and then just slam them with fluids. That's not the thing to do. Remember, they are DKA. The excess blood glucose in there will make them hypertensive. So you're adding insult to injury by just slamming them with fluid. Believe it or not, they're going to need to go to the hospital, get insulin, and actually start getting fluids to help rehydrate, and it needs to be done slowly and gradually. Do not slam them with fluids thinking like, oh my God, their blood glucose is so high, it needs to move. I remember Justin saying that we can move this with fluids and they can pee it off. Well, good luck with that, because then if you actually do that and you don't hurt them even worse, they'll be looking to pee in your ambulance. So have fun with that. They still need rehydration in the HHS. I don't know why they call it honk. I guess it's something else. I actually find that very funny. It used to be HHNS for me, like I said earlier, but whatever. They're talking about, too, if you have altered mental status patients, whether it be DKA or HHS, you might have to do C-spine because they may have fallen or passed out from this. So just be careful with that, too. And that's it. That is the end of your chapter 21 for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again.